conversation to try to share with you some of the thinking that happens and the work that's happening currently in the studios. I'll begin by introducing the zone, which is a kind of a interdisciplinary collaboration. It's a space between art, science and philosophy that is seeking to create a sort of autonomous place for itself where we can come as individuals with our previous lived experience and our bodies of knowledge together to create projects that are neither art nor science but informed by both. And we have certain questions that are leading us, certain points of provocation. So today we wanted to introduce ourselves as the zone. This is Johannes Jaeger, who goes by Yogi. He is an evolutionary biologist and now philosopher. This is Bashak Shenova, who's a curator and designer. And myself and my partner, Markus Neustetter and Bronwyn, we are artists originally from South Africa, but living in Vienna, and we work in a multi-transdisciplinary way ourselves with the mediums. So I'm going to ask Yogi to tell you a little bit about Wissenskunst, which is a kind of provocation that gives us momentum into some of our thinking.
So what we're trying to do is we're trying to play with ideas from philosophy, from science, ideas that are actually serious. So our play is serious play with these ideas. But it's play. That's what scientists and philosophers have maybe a bit forgotten how to do. Why is this important? I think among all the problems that we have today as humanity, the worst, or maybe the root of all the problems, is that we've somehow lost a bit of our touch with reality. And so what we're going to do today is show you two of the projects that we have that we've arranged along this sort of axis here. And there is an artist dimension down here, and there's a more philosophical dimension up there. So this is very abstract in the beginning. And then we'll introduce two of the concrete projects. So bear with me. If this is all too abstract, just hang on in there, and it'll get more concrete later on. So this, relationship that we have, or that we've lost to reality, makes us ask, what is reality? Okay, everybody apparently today can make up their own facts, and that's a real problem. But we also know that all the knowledge that humanity has created is indeed human knowledge, okay? So it's not some sort of view from nowhere, it's our own knowledge. It's biased, it's limited. So how can we know that we really know something, right? And what's worse, in the 20th century, philosophers have started to think that you can only think about things that you can put in words. And Vienna is the root and origin of this problem. Here, triplicate version of this man, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his Tractatus, he wrote as the last sentence, worüber man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. Whereof you cannot speak, thereof you shall be silent. And this has locked us into a cage of language. It's absurd. Humans are the only species, as far as we know on Earth, that think this way. And we think other creatures don't think, but also the experience that we have is mostly not words. Not even thoughts that you can think and remember. Not explicit, yeah? So, reality, text, thought that you can put into text. But Wittgenstein was right. He said you cannot do philosophy about something you cannot talk about. Right? How would you do that? Well, that is the question we're going to raise. So we've deconstructed Kafka's Metamorphosis as one of our projects. Now we're deconstructing Wittgenstein's statement that you cannot talk about the things you cannot talk about. He's right, because you cannot talk about them. But how can we express them? And this, of course, is where art comes in. It's extremely important so that the philosophers and the scientists don't forget that that part of reality, which is the biggest part of reality, actually exists. This we have called the ontology of the undefinable, and it's going to be a film. It's going to be a great film, it's going to be a long film, but it's going to be a film that's not going to come out for quite some time, because we're still working on it. But this is one of the projects we're engaged in right now. So this is only one side. So we're thinking, what is real and what is the relationship between our words, our language, and reality? In the other corner, and I'm going to hand over to Bronwyn in just a second, is magical realism. The works of Borges and Italo Calvino and authors like that, and many more since then. But they have pioneered this kind of style, which is a style of writing where you make the unreal real through words. Can you see the mirror image? So this is the opposite of what we're trying to do over there.
And speaking of mirrors, Borges, in his story Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, has a great moment where he says, mirrors and copulation are abominable because they multiply the number of people.
So this creates a tension between these two poles, okay? And we thrive in this tension. We don't want to resolve this tension, but we want to bounce back and forth in the space between those different poles.
We've begun to notice as artists that tension of the not knowing, but still the being and the playing, and the misunderstanding, the slippages of translation that happen between our disciplines is a very fertile generative ground upon which to build some scaffolding. So this is an attempt at describing some of that scaffolding for thinking about the metacrises that we face right now through different lenses. So Yogi is writing a book. He's not writing a book in a way that most people who write a book would write it. As he writes it, he shares it in its rawest, most vulnerable form. And he not only shares it online as this kind of expanding chapters unfolding in front of you, but he also shares it with us, and in particular shares it with my collaborator, Marcus Neustetter, who draws. He draws through thinking. You'll see here some of the ways in which he walks. When he hikes, he has these Laparello books with him, and using the substrates that he finds along the way, he documents his journey, both physical and emotional, inside of the book, right? So a lot of what we come to here is, how do we read differently? How do we absorb information in an alternative way that opens up some of these cracks that give us more generative space instead of closing them down into the very narrow confines of our disciplines? And so perhaps we can show the demon and its death. And Yogi can speak to this in part as an example of how, through our multiple ways of communicating, we're meditating on these topics.
So this idea that we can understand the whole world, this idea was made human. So Laplace imagined a being, maybe a bit like a human being, but much smarter, that would know everything about the universe, as it is right now. And because that being knows everything, it could both predict the future perfectly and also reconstruct the past. This is a metaphor for something called determinism, that everything in the world is determined. And still today, a lot of scientists and philosophers think about the world this way. I am a philosopher and a scientist. And this chapter of the book talks about how this demon must die forever and ever. We have to forget about the idea that limited beings like us can understand the whole world in its entirety. It doesn't even make sense to think about this. But on the other hand, in this time of post-fact and everything relative, we also have to think, again, how do we not lose our reality if we know that we will never be able to understand everything? This is the crisis that we're in, as a society, but also as an academia and as a community of artists. And what we want to do is want to engage very seriously with this problem in a way that we don't just reach our colleagues in the ivory tower or in the studio next door. So what we're trying to do here is, for every chapter of the book, we produce a little lecture that's about 7 minutes long in this case. And what's happened here is that obviously the soundtrack has been replaced. What you see is an illustration of my reading of the chapter, my summary of the chapter, a philosophical argument about the demon and how it must die. But when you came in earlier, if you came in earlier and looked at this, you probably couldn't guess this. So just by underlaying it with a different sound, it teaches you something completely different, which is your way of reading what we've done here, what Marcus has drawn. So this shows you how there are at least two sides to experience all the time. The scientific objective and the subjective. And we often think science is doing the objective part and art is supposed to do the subjective part. But if those two don't work together, you will never understand the world. And one of the biggest problems that we have is that everything has been completely fragmented. And often when we do collaborations across arts and science, the artist is illustrating someone's science. Or we're doing artistic research, which often is very interesting. But believe me, as a scientist, it is not science very often. Okay? We don't want to criticize all of that, but we also don't want to do that. Instead, we want to completely forget about the scaffold, the institutions, the ideas that are art and science. We can't completely forget that. But we can play with it. Yeah? What happened to the movie? Got stuck. That's maybe good.
Yeah.
And I won't talk on forever.
Good.
Because what we want to do with this project, Wissenskunst, is to take those frameworks, those ideas, and to play with them. This is the only thing that we can do. Bronwyn.
So when we're doing it, one concrete example, which is so not concrete, it's still concrete in its liquid form, before you've poured it, is a reading of a text that I mentioned before by Borges, that is called Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius. It's 5 pages, and I don't understand it, but I am completely intrigued and compelled by it, because as I read it, and I've read it many times, there are visceral visuals that come into my mind's eye and give me clues as to what I want to work with. So I know that the story that Borges has written is a detective story. It's a conversation between himself and Vio Casares, who in the real world was his friend. But he's kind of made narrative of these two figures. And they're having a conversation about an encyclopedia that has been found. Here it is. This is Britannica, and it was bought by my parents as a set when they were expecting me as a baby, sometime in the late 70s. It was how they were hoping, growing up in rural Botswana, they would be able to give me a kind of embedded education about the world. It's now redundant. It's largely inaccurate. This is a map of New York. And And Borges is writing about an encyclopedia. He and his friend Casares are interested in this encyclopedia because in this encyclopedia, which seems to be a copy, a forgery of a real encyclopedia, there is a particular article about a country called Uqbar. It apparently exists in the real world, but as we know, it is made up. And in Uqbar, there is a conspiracy of intellectuals from varying disciplines who have constructed a planet called Tlön. The descriptions of this planet are what compel me. And as I said, there's some really lovely phrases, some things that resonate, like copulation and mirrors being abominable. And the idea that there's this conspiracy of intellectuals who are constructing a world for us. Tlön as a planet has two hemispheres. And when you learn about the languages that are spoken in these hemispheres, something happens. A kind of something that collapses Western philosophy as being even possible. And it's basically that these two languages, these two hemispheres of languages, both share a fact, which is that they have no nouns. In the northern hemisphere, they speak through verbs. And I want to share that with you because there's something really beautiful about the Ursprache of Tlön. Let's talk about the moon. They give us this object, the moon, right? It's a big noun for us. The ways in which in the northern hemisphere you would speak about the moon is to say to moonate or to moon. And I think that, so if you were to talk about the moon rising for us, perhaps you would say, upward behind the on-streaming it mooned. Now in the southern hemisphere, again, no nouns, but in this case, they speak through adjective. And I think I would want to live in the southern hemisphere because in order to talk about the moon, one would say aerial bright, above dark round, or soft amberish celestial. Why is it interesting to me that we remove the nouns? Well, if I know, for example, that 70% apparently of the English language is made up of nouns, one then understands quite clearly why we are so fixated on the material and not on that which is non-permanent and a process. We know in this real world that there are languages that are not noun obsessed and that work through the verb and the adjective. And these, interestingly, are often cultures that are both very vulnerable, have been ostracized, but are also not imprisoned by their obsession with what they own and what they can have.
So basically, we're not trying to deconstruct art and science and philosophy at all. Well, we are trying to deconstruct the constraints that constrain us instead of enabling us We're trying to get past those. We're not destroying them. We're taking them. We're looking at them. Are they useful? Are they not? Is there another way? Because this is the kind of thinking that we need today. We don't have to think about rules within the rules. We have to think, we have to play with the rules. And to come back to Wittgenstein in his later phase, there are two Wittgensteins. There's the early Wittgenstein that I introduced before, and there's the late Wittgenstein that contradicted everything the early Wittgenstein said. And the late Wittgenstein, he said, rules are made by doing. Okay? So rules don't exist and then we act according to them. We act, and according to the ways we act, those rules evolve. So they don't come from nowhere. They're not arbitrary. They have a history, but they are made by us. So what we are going to do is we are going to create this space between arts and science. And it'll be our space. And there's lots of space left. So everybody else can come and create their own spaces in between there. And I think the world would be much better off if a lot more people would be doing this kind of thing.
So maybe reality becomes fiction, and when exposed to fiction, it influences the real world.